Alright, so we're going to pick up our next section now with the topic we ended with last time, and that is the metapopulation. So if the idea of a metapopulation didn't quite make sense before, hopefully this picture will help a little bit. The idea here is we have an overall range or a territory in which there are subpopulations of some species that exist throughout this range. And so we have these subpopulations. We have dispersal back and forth, right? So one of the hallmarks of a metapopulation is the fact there has to be movement between and among the subpopulations, so that if, say, this one in the middle here is a source, it produces more individuals than can exist here, so those individuals are going to move out or emigrate out of 3 to 1, 2, 4, and 5, then this population here in the middle, number 3, could actually supply excess individuals or surplus individuals out to these others surrounding what might be sink populations, where maybe conditions aren't quite as good and maybe mortality is relatively high, so it might be sort of like a rescue effect on the rest of these other subpopulations. The next thing we're going to look at is something called demography. And demography is where we study the overall population processes. So when we're trying to figure out the overall size and distribution of a population, there are some primary things we're going to look at. These would be things like natality, and another way of saying natality that's not quite as fancy is just saying birth rate. Mortality is the same as death rate. And there are 2 types of dispersal. There is emigration with an E at the beginning. Emigration is where you have individuals leaving a habitat. And then you also have immigration with an I at the beginning, where you have individuals moving into a habitat. So that's kind of our primary forces here involved with demographic processes. Secondary factors are anything which can control or affect primary factors, so things like the weather, things like food supply, things like any sort of natural enemies, whether it's herbivores or parasites or pathogens or predators, breeding habitat if that's a factor, overwintering habitat if that's a factor. All of these things can have effects on those primary factors. So if weather is suitable and food's in good supply and there aren't many predators around, natality might be pretty high and mortality might be pretty low. Whereas if those factors are in short supply, then you might have an increase in mortality and a decrease in natality, for example. Okay, so back to where we were a second ago. In addition to the secondary factors and primary factors, we can then look at the overall change in population size, which is really what we're most interested in here, is we want to look at how the population is changing, whether it's increasing, whether it's decreasing, or whether it's staying the same. So we're not going to go into this. We'll skip this slide. The next thing we want to look at as part of demography is sex ratio. So in other words, how many males there are in the population compared to how many females are in a population. So if, for example, you have a sex ratio of 50-50, where there's approximately 1 male for every 1 female, or pretty close to that, that tells you that males are pretty important. If you just simply look at, biologically speaking, how many males you need to father the parents in the entire next generation, typically it's not that many. Right? 1 male can produce plenty of sperm cells to fertilize almost every female in a population. So you really don't need to have 1 male to every female just to have fertilization. So when you see a 50-50 sex ratio, what that tells you is that males are actually important for helping to take care of offspring. Maybe the environment's relatively harsh, maybe you need both parents around to fend off predators or search for food or build a nest or those kinds of things. Otherwise, you wouldn't expect males to be quite as common in the population, because all else equal, the population doesn't get as much capacity for growth with males as it does for females. Another factor to think about here is generation time. So how long does it take for an organism to complete its life cycle? Something that's got a really, really short generation time can evolve very quickly. If you only take, a fraction of an hour to go through a generation, you're going to be able to change as a species way faster than if it takes you 100 years to complete a generation. That kind of makes sense. So if we look down here on this graph, we've got kind of a interesting linear relationship between generation time versus body size. And in general, the bigger you are, the longer your generation time is going to be. We see things like sequoia trees, giant sequoia trees, 100 meters in height, nearly 300 feet or more in height for sequoia trees, or also redwood trees, or even a bit taller. They're really, really big, but they also take a really, really long time to complete their life cycle. We see some smaller things on here, kind of interesting. We've got horseshoe crabs. They're like 10 years, and they're not that big, right? They're relatively small. So there are some exceptions here, but for the most part, there's a pretty good predictor of generation time and body size relationship here. We can also look at age structure. So is a population relatively young? Is it relatively old? Is it more or less flat? Is it more or less the same number of old and young individuals as well as those in the middle as well? That's another factor that will tell us something about our population too. Here is an example of a couple of age pyramids where we take individuals, both male and female, we separate them out by sex, and then we look at the number of individuals that are in each age category from 0 to 4 and 5 to 9, 10 to 14, 15 to 19, and so on. And so the idea here is you can take what's called a cohort, which is the entire batch of individuals born, say, in a given year, and you can track them throughout their life and find out how long they live, right? So if you have individuals, most of them die when they're young versus most that die in middle age versus most that die when they're older. Those are very, very different types of population characteristics. In these age pyramids, two very, very different types of countries, right? We've got Sweden, which is a very much developed world, industrialized country. And then we've got Kenya, which is not really third world, but it's definitely not, you wouldn't say, industrialized either. So these two populations are extremely different. Sweden is more or less stable in terms of its age structure. There are about as many young people as there are old people, all the way and up to kind of average human lifespan of 75 or 80 years. If you look at Kenya, on the other hand, there are far, far more people in the younger age classes than there are in the older age classes. And one thing that might tell you is that, well, this population in Kenya, it's going to grow a lot in the coming years because most of your population is just now approaching reproductive age. Population size is only going to go up if everybody has 2 or more kids. So, you see populations that have a bottom-heavy age structure. That means they're going to grow. The other alternative that I didn't show you on this graph is more of a top-heavy distribution, which is what you would see in a place like Japan, for example, where they've actually got a top-heavy distribution, where there's more people in older age classes and fewer people in younger age classes, and it would be predicted then those populations should be shrinking in coming years because the older people will die off and there aren't as many young people to replace them, so their population size will actually go down. Another factor to think about is fecundity. Fecundity is the ability to produce offspring and how many offspring you produce. So again, in some countries, the fecundity is going to be higher in those places than others. If you look at industrialized, relatively wealthy countries like most Western nations, people aren't going to have as many kids because kids are very expensive in those countries. It's expensive to feed them and clothe them and entertain them and send them to school and all those kinds of things, especially when you start thinking about college and those sorts of things. Whereas in a third world country where most of those things aren't really a factor, right? You're just looking for basic biological needs to support those kids. You're not sending them to college or even thinking of doing so. Kids are relatively cheap, and not only that, they can help you out by working in the house or working on the farm and selling things at market and those sorts of things. So in poorer countries, in third world places especially, where death rates are high, you often tend to see a higher fecundity because infant mortality is high, so people want to have more kids because chances are they're going to lose 1 or 2 or more of them. But also, they're not very expensive individually, so why not have a bunch if they can help you out around the house or on the farm? Have a bunch, have 10 of them if that will help in the house. All of these things help affect population's growth rate, right? Sweden has got a relatively stable growth rate. Kenya's got a relatively high growth rate. Other countries are more of a top-heavy, declining growth rate sort of situation, so it depends on the overall structure of the population. Another factor here to look at that will tell you something about a population is what's called a survivorship curve. So survivorship is your relative chances of making it to like the next age interval. So if you are 5 years old, what is the probability that you might make it to a 6-year-old stage, something like that? And so there are basically 3 different types of survivorship curves, again, depending on the type of organism you're looking at. We have what's called a type 1 survivorship curve, where infant mortality and mortality of young individuals is relatively low, and then it drops off later in life once you sort of get out to approaching the maximum lifespan of the species. You could have a type 3 survivorship curve, where most young individuals die off, not that many survive, but for those that do, they live for a relatively long time. And I should also point out here that this bottom one especially, this doesn't level off. These don't live forever, right? This eventually should go down to 0 surviving, but I can only draw this so precisely in PowerPoint, so it's a little bit awkward in how it's drawn. But this should eventually go down to 0 surviving at some point in time. Or you could have a linear decrease where you've got an equal probability of survival in any age class. Doesn't matter if you're young, old, in the middle. everybody's got, say, a 10% chance of mortality at any given point in their life. So you might want to think about different kinds of organisms that might show you these different survivorship curves. Type 1 survivorship curves, things that have really good parental care, things like primates, and in that would be humans included as well. Infant mortality is relatively low. Most young offspring survive because they're taken care of by their parents and others around them. But then at some point in time, as you approach the maximum lifespan of the species, obviously everybody's going to die off at some point in time. A type 3 survivorship curve would be like what you see in most plants. It would be what you see in some fishes. It would be what you see in sea turtles is a really good example of a type 3 survivorship curve. If you look at something like a loggerhead sea turtle, which is one of the more common types of what's actually a group of all endangered species, but loggerheads are probably the most common. Loggerhead sea turtles will lay, on average, maybe 120 eggs per nest. And of those 120 eggs, that female will be extremely lucky if only one of them or two of them survive to adulthood. The vast majority of those eggs will die or be consumed before the offspring ever make it to the water. And for those that do make it to the water, most of them will be eaten at some point. So the chances of survival for any given sea turtle offspring is less than 1% by far. But for those that do survive, they can expect to live decades, even 100 years or more. They can live for a really, really long time if they make it to that really large adult stage. But that's exceedingly unlikely that any given turtle will make it to that age point. As far as type 2 survivorship, a good example here would be birds. Typically, there's an equal likelihood of survival or mortality at any given age class. It doesn't matter if you're an egg, a nestling, a juvenile, an adult. There's pretty much an equal likelihood of surviving to the next age point, regardless of what your age is. So the next section that we're going to start now is on population growth. We are going to look at two of the most basic models of population growth. I'm going to show you just a little bit of some kind of theoretical math here that would be used to predict the size of a population over a period of time. If you look at the simplest model of population growth, that would be what we call exponential growth of a population. That would be in a population that has no limits to growth. Okay, so if the environment is perfect, if there's unlimited food, unlimited space, there are no natural enemies, no competition, no crowding, everything is perfect, right? That would be exponential growth. It's the complete ability for a population to grow in perfect conditions. We call that exponential growth. And so what we look at here is this R value, which is growth rate, and that would be the ideal growth rate in perfect conditions. That R value is equal to the number of births in the population minus the number of deaths plus the number of individuals coming in. This is immigration minus the number of individuals going out. So that would be emigration. So you might imagine that if the environment's really, really good, if it's really nice, then obviously births are going to be way, way higher than deaths. Maybe nobody dies because the environment's so good. And you'd also have a lot of individuals coming in and nobody leaving because, again, the environment's perfect, and why would you want to leave a perfect environment? So clearly this is not going to be something that happens very often. If it does happen, it's going to be for a very, very short period of time, but it's very useful in helping us to look at how populations might grow as kind of like a baseline starting point. Once you start factoring in limiting food and natural enemies and that kind of stuff, well, then you can start to see that, well, populations really aren't going to grow at this number for very long because there's always going to be something in there that's going to limit the population's growth rate. But it's a good starting point. This R value is what we call the intrinsic growth rate of a population. It's the ability of a population to grow in perfect conditions with no limiting factors. How fast can they grow? Like how many new individuals can they produce per given unit at a time in ideal conditions? And then from there, since most populations don't grow in ideal conditions, we can start thinking about some of the factors that might limit a population's growth and thereby detract from that intrinsic growth rate over time. So if we look, again, if we take a population that's in ideal conditions, we can take its intrinsic growth rate, which is our R value, we can multiply that by the number of individuals in the population, and that's going to give us a growth rate. That's going to give us an ability to predict into the future how many individuals might be in our population. So again, with our little equation here, this is the simplest of all equations for population growth rate. We just simply take the intrinsic growth rate, because there's nothing limiting, it's perfect conditions, times the number of individuals in the population, so n is number, and that's going to give us our population growth rate. And what's going to happen here is it's going to come out to be what's called a J-shaped curve, or just an exponential curve. It's J-shaped, right? That's exponential growth under perfect conditions. Now, Most populations, like we mentioned, aren't going to grow that way very frequently. The times where this can occur would be in situations where maybe you've got a species that colonizes an island for the first time, and there isn't much life on the island, so that species gets to grow very, very quickly. It's got all kinds of food, it doesn't have much in the way of competition or predation or pathogens, so it's able to grow very, very quickly for a while until eventually some of those factors come in and start to limit our population size. So that would also be what we would call a population explosion. They're going to grow really, really fast for a period of time until they reach their limit. And the limit of the environment to support individuals is called a carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is how many individuals of a population the environment will support. The number of individuals of a population the environment will support. That's carrying capacity, and in a second here we're going to abbreviate carrying capacity with the letter K. The K is going to be short for carrying capacity. It's the limit. It's the maximum population size the environment can support indefinitely. It's a sustainable population size if you want to think about it that way. All right, so now we're going to factor in our carrying capacity. So if we take our exponential growth rate, our intrinsic growth rate times our population size, and then we're going to take into account this factor over here. We're going to take our population carrying capacity minus population size, and we're going to divide by carrying capacity. Okay, so if you think about what this term actually means, if the carrying capacity is really high, and then population size is really low, then basically what we're going to have here is K divided by K. Right, so it's going to be essentially then if this cancels out, if this number is always close to 0, and this K is canceled by that K, then you can kind of omit this entire term here, and what we're left with is exponential growth rate. Population size is low, we're going to see exponential growth for a while. But the bigger the population size is, and as it approaches K, so think about what happened if N was equal to K. If K was 50 and N was 50, then you'd have 50 minus 50, which is 0, divided by 50, which would make this term 0, right? It would make this term 0, which would then make this term 0 as well, which would mean our growth rate would be 0. Or you could think about, okay, what happens if the population size is greater than carrying capacity? What happens if K is 50 and N is 100? Well, now we're going to have negative 50 divided by 50, so that's going to be a negative 1. And so what's that going to do to growth rate of the population? It's going to make growth rate negative, which means the population is going to shrink. So this formula is actually kind of handy. It's not really meant to be applied literally in real world situations, but what it does do is it gives you a good kind of overall picture of what would occur in different kinds of conditions. And there are cases where you could actually apply this literally in a population growth rate scenario, but at the very least, it's instructive in showing us how populations respond when they're above or below or at their carrying capacity. We look over here, this is a type of organism called Daphnia. It's a crustacean related to crabs and oysters and those kinds of things. And we see a growth rate, time versus number of cladocerans, which is the group these guys are in. And so starting off at a very, very low population size, it grows for a while exponentially. This is J-shaped growth. This is R times N right here, growth rate. Population growth rate is exponential. And then eventually it goes up pretty high, and then it drops off and kind of levels off. And so what you're left with is something which looks kind of like this S-shaped curve over here on the right, only with the curve up here on the left. This one's got a little bit of a bump, and then it drops off again. It would be like if we took this curve like above carrying capacity up here somewhere, and then brought it back down again. That's what this curve is doing. This curve down here with fur seals is very much S-shaped growth, very much what we call sigmoidal or S-shaped, or the type of growth rate where the population size increases very quickly at first, but then levels off at some point in time as you approach carrying capacity. Right, so we could actually look at the calculus involved here. You could actually, if you wanted to, calculate the slopes of these lines, and from that you could calculate growth rate at any given point in time. We're not going to do that, but what it does do is it compares J-shaped exponential growth versus S-shaped sigmoidal, or what we call logistic growth rate over here, which is a different type of growth rate where it levels off at carrying capacity. The blue line is in most cases far more common, far more likely to be reached than the red line. The red line only happens when you have very, very specific conditions, things that move onto an island for the first time, things that find new habitats for the first time, relatively uncommon in nature. The one really big exception to that would be humans, because humans as a species, our growth rate has been exponential since we originated, and it so far has not leveled off very much. It's still very much climbing. It's not leveling off yet at a carrying capacity. And we'll talk more about what a carrying capacity for humans might look like later on. It turns out that's a really hard thing to estimate, but we'll talk about that concept a little bit later too. All right, so something else to think about here is as we mentioned this a second ago with the formula, but as population size, or N, approaches K, which is carrying capacity, population growth rate begins to slow down. So again, if we think about over here, our population size versus population growth rate. We've got positive growth rate up here above the blue line. We've got negative growth rate down here below the blue line. All right, so what we want to think about here is for population size, okay? So population size, if it is less than carrying capacity, so here's our carrying capacity, the point where N equals K, right? N equals K, that's carrying capacity. If your population size is somewhere less than, so the x-axis down here is population size. If population size is below K, then population size should increase until K is reached. If population size is above K, if it's out here somewhere on the x-axis, then population size should shrink until it reaches carrying capacity. And of course, if it's at carrying capacity, it shouldn't change at all. But those are, again, the growth rate, positive, negative, or zero, versus population size below carrying capacity, at carrying capacity, or above carrying capacity. And sometimes seeing a graph like this actually kind of helps. You have to take, admittedly, a few minutes to look at it, think about what it's showing you, but in some ways, this is actually a lot more intuitive to see it in front of you in picture form than it might be just to read about it in words. And you can show a lot more image or details about a concept in an image than you can just, a written paragraph kind of a thing. So hopefully that kind of makes sense. It's kind of a big concept, but it's actually a really important one, not only for natural species, but for what we're doing as well, for humans, and what our carrying capacity might be, and where our population size might be in terms of the carrying capacity. We can apply all of those things in a situation like that. All right, so we're going to stop here, and when we start the next section, we're going to talk about different ways to affect population size, density dependent and independent factors, for example. We'll take a look at those next.